Welcome to another bonus edition of Upon Further Review, and this is the NFC Conference Championship edition of Upon Further Review, where we'll be talking about the Green Bay Packers versus the defending champion Seattle Seahawks. And this matchup will be happening at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can catch that on your local Fox affiliates. And this is a rematch from Week 1. And for those of you that are not familiar with Upon Further Review, what this is I go over the numbers, all the statistics between these two teams going into this game. I also give my analysis and commentary while giving you some video to enjoy some Madden gameplay where I play out the game in Madden. I take the team that I'm actually picking to win the game. In this case, it's the Seattle Seahawks. So I'm playing in Madden as the Seahawks against the Packers in the NFC Conference Championship. So that's what you're watching while I'm going over the numbers and giving my personal opinion on what I think is going to happen in this game. Let me know in the comments section below what you think is going to happen, where you might agree or disagree with what I have to say here, and just overall what you think is going to happen in the game. Very interested to read your thoughts and opinions, and can't wait to watch this one. It's going to be a classic game. It's been a pretty good year for football, and some really good playoff football has happened so far. We're down to the final 4 teams. Said these two teams are number 1 and number 2 in the NFC, and the Seahawks, the defending champs. They both come into this game with a record of 12-4. But in Week 1, when they faced off in the very first game of this regular season, that was on Thursday Night Football way back on September 4th. And that was in Seattle, and the Seahawks won that game 36-16. They dominated the Packers. They beat them by 20 points. And it wasn't even really that close, because one of the touchdowns the Packers ended up getting in that game was actually due to a fumble on a punt. As Earl Thomas was actually returning the first punt of his career, and Sherman actually blocked a player into him, and it was a muffed recovery. He didn't catch the ball. The Packers recovered. It was actually Clinton Dix recovered it, and then the Packers went on to score, and that was one of their touchdowns right there. You take that away, they only put up 9 points actually. Let's actually take a minute to go into some of the numbers in that game. So you take away that touchdown, then the only other touchdown they scored was late in the 4th quarter. Besides that, they had that Mason Crosby field goal, but the Seahawks dominated. It was close in the first quarter between these two teams when they faced off way back in Week 1. Back in September, it was 7-3 through the first. But then the second quarter, just 2 minutes in, 33-yard touchdown pass from Wilson to Lockett gave the Seahawks the lead. Crosby ended up tying it up, but then they took back the lead with the 9-yard touchdown run by beast mode Marshawn Lynch. He had a huge game. He had 20 carries for 110 yards and 2 touchdowns. And that touchdown there put the Seahawks ahead, and they would not trail for the rest of the game. And they actually, the only time they did trail was in the first quarter, after the first quarter. But then they took the lead. The Packers tied it up. They took the lead back, and then they went on to score, let's see here, 12 unanswered points, because they got a field goal, they got a safety, then another touchdown by beast mode before the Packers would get that last touchdown with the 3-yard pass from Rodgers to Cobb, and they went for 2 points. They didn't get it. And that was with 9.5 left in the 4th, and then with 2.5 left, Russell Wilson hit Derek Coleman. That would give them the 20-point lead and seal the deal. The Seahawks were a little bit of a different team. They had Percy Harvin back then, and actually Percy Harvin was their leading receiver in that game. He had 100 total yards in that game as well, because he had 59 receiving yards and he had 41 rushing yards, but he's not on the team anymore. They ended up trading him to the Jets. But their defense came up huge in that game. They sacked Rodgers 3 times. Bennett had 2 sacks. Averill had 1. Bobby Wagner had 14 tackles. Cam Chancellor had 11 tackles in that game. Maxwell had an interception. As I'm sure you're all familiar with, Richard Sherman did not get thrown at even one time. Aaron Rodgers just totally avoided Richard Sherman. He was afraid to throw the ball his way, and actually Maxwell made him pay as he ended up getting that pick off. Maxwell actually played a phenomenal game. As Rodgers only had 189 passing yards in the game, 1 touchdown and 1 interception. So right there, you've seen that the defense was already playing really solid. And after that game, I remember, you can look back to the recap we actually did. I'll actually leave a link in the description below of our recap of that game back in week 1. And the way it was looking after week 1, and I actually went over it in the wedge as well, and I was talking about how the Seahawks look like they're, just as good as they were last year when they won the Super Bowl. They're picking up right where they left off. They did have some struggles early on in their season, though, but their defense is actually playing better now than they were back then, and they won the game by 20 points. Actually, let's go over the rest of the season real quick for the Packers and then the Seahawks. So after that loss to Seattle, they ended up bouncing back with a win at home against the Jets. It was actually a come-from-behind victory. They beat them by just a touchdown. It was one of the better games the Jets played other than that final game of the season. But then the Packers went to Detroit. They lost to the Lions in a tough defensive battle. Then they went to Chicago. They bounced back and evened up their record at 500 with a win at Soldier Field. That was the start of a 4-game winning streak for the Packers, where they ended up going back home. They beat the Vikings, then they went to Miami and they beat the Dolphins. That was an amazing game right there. Come from behind. Rodgers hit Corliss for that touchdown in the fourth quarter as they got the victory by just 3 points over the Dolphins. Then they hosted the Panthers. They ended up beating them by 21. They then went down to New Orleans, and that was a Sunday Night Football. They ended up losing that game by 21. But then after a bye week, they bounced back with another Sunday night game. That one was in Lambeau Field against the Bears, and this time Rodgers threw 6 touchdowns in the first half. They put up 55 points against the Bears, and they dominated them, and that was the start of a 5-game winning streak, where they ended up hosting the Eagles the next week, and they put up 53 points. So it was 108 points they put up in just 2 games there during that stretch. And at that time, the Eagles were one of the hot teams, and it was looking like the Eagles were going to win the NFC East. But that actually kind of put their season on a different turn, where they ended up missing the playoffs altogether, although the Eagles did finish with double-digit victories. But the Packers would then go on to Minnesota, and they beat the Vikings. It was a tight game. Division rivalries always are. And then they hosted the Patriots. The Patriots are one of the 4 teams left here in the playoffs. They're going to be hosting the Colts in the AFC Championship game, when the Patriots went to Lambeau Field and what was considered one of the best games of the 2014 season. Well, that was a 5-point game. The Patriots nearly came back to win, but the defense of Green Bay was able to hold them off in the end. They put up enough points as Aaron Rodgers had 368 passing yards in that game. Devontae Adams had 121 receiving yards to be their leading receiver, and ELiAS had 98 yards, just 2 shy of 100. And the Packers won that one by 5 points. And then on Monday Night Football the following week, they hosted the Falcons. They put up 43. The Falcons did put up a lot of points later on in the game to make it a 6-point, final score difference. 43-37, but really they had dominated the Falcons. The Falcons are the kind of team, though, too, that at the end of the game, once the team's playing pre-event, they can, kind of chip away and put up some numbers. They do have, some talent there, but that was the 5-game winning streaks, and they went to Buffalo, and they ended up losing to the Bills. Not many people thought that the Bills would win that game. I actually did pick that game. You could go back and check that out on further review for that game and our quick picks from back in week 15. It was actually, like I said, not many people thought that was going to happen, and that was a game that actually really made a difference towards where this game would be played. Of course, back in week 1, the difference was made when the Seahawks beat the Packers straight up, but also that game right there, if they beat Buffalo, then they would have ended up being the number 1 seed. They did finish the season with a couple of wins, first going down to Tampa and beating the Bucks 20-3, and then they hosted the Lions, and they ended up splitting the season series as they beat them by 10 points as they avenged their loss earlier in the season at Ford Field. And that was the regular season for the Packers. And then last week in the divisional round of the playoffs, they hosted the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys were coming in red hot, and they were able to defeat them. And it was actually the same score as when the Packers hosted the Patriots, 26-21. And again, Rodgers put up 300-plus yards. At least he actually reached the 100 mark, as he had 101 yards rushing the game. And again, Devontae Adams, the leading receiver, just as in that New England game. And that was a classic game. Controversial somewhat, you know. People have been talking about that all week long. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, with the Dez Bryant catch, no catch, however you want to call it. But that's how the cookie crumbles. And a week earlier, Dallas had gotten that call against Detroit, and then the next week they end up having to go the other way against them. And that's just the breaks. And the Packers end up winning that one. There's still plenty of game left. And I mean, if you lose by just one play, well, you didn't necessarily deserve to win now, did you? Because if you want to win, you can't let it be in the hands of the referees. You got to win decisively. But that's how the Packers got to this point. Let's look at the Seahawks in their season after beating the Packers there in Week 1. Things, you know, they were riding high. They won the Super Bowl, and they were winless after that. But then they went to San Diego, and they lost a tight game against the Chargers. A really tough Chargers team, too. That was a 9-point loss, but then they bounced back the next week in the rematch of Super Bowl 48 as they hosted the Broncos. That game went to overtime, and I believe it was beast mode. Marshawn Lynch ended up winning that with a touchdown in overtime. So they won that game. They had their bye week. They then went to Washington. They beat the Redskins on Monday Night Football. But then they hosted the Cowboys, the team that lost to the Packers last week, as I just stated a moment ago. But in the match there, Dallas at Seattle, they ended up losing by a touchdown, as Dallas actually played probably their best defense of the year in that game. It was a tight game. It would have been interesting to see if the Cowboys would have came back there and seen the rematch of that one. Of course, this is going to be a really good game as well. But in Week 7, they ended up going to St. Louis, and they lost by just 2 points to their division rivals. That was another controversial game, a controversial call, that fumble there late in the game. And Russell Wilson, a huge game in that one. He had 313 passing yards, 106 rushing yards. Put up big numbers. He had a really good season, Russell Wilson. He's probably one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the NFL. And that's crazy when you consider the fact that he is playing in the NFC Championship game against who is probably considered to be one of the top quarterbacks playing today, like in his prime, and Aaron Rodgers. But I tell you, Russell Wilson, he's a very good quarterback as well, and he is the future of the NFL. But in Week 8 in Carolina, they bounced back. They got a win against the Panthers, and they ended up facing them, last week in the divisional round. They beat them the first time around in the regular season, a tight defensive battle. They ended up beating them, obviously, last week as well to get to this game. We'll go over that in a moment. But in Week 9, they ended up hosting the Raiders. They beat them. It was actually a tight game. Oakland, not as bad as their record would indicate. Then in Week 10, they hosted the Giants. They beat up on them pretty well. They beat them by 21 points. Then they went to Kansas City. They played one of the best games of the year, that game right there between the Chiefs and the Seahawks, and it was the type of game where somebody had to win, somebody had to lose, even though both teams deserved to win. And it could have very well ended up in a tie, but the Chiefs won that one, and that broke apart what would have actually been, if they had not lost that game. They had a 3-game winning streak before that game. They ended up ending the season with a 6-game winning streak. So they would have actually finished the season on a 10-game winning streak if it wasn't for that 4-point loss. If you actually go back to that 2-point loss to St. Louis, you could say it would have been an 11-game winning streak. And if you actually went back to that Dallas game where they lost by just a touchdown, well, then they would have went 15-1. They only lost one game by more than a possession. But after that loss to Kansas City, they didn't lose another game. As I just said, they ended up finishing on a 6-game winning streak, and they ended up finishing in that period against their division rivals. They had both, 2 games against the Cardinals, 2 games against the Niners, and a game against the St. Louis Rams as well. So they had 5 games against division rivals, and they also had a game against Philadelphia. It all started off with the game against Arizona. That was in Seattle. They beat them 19-3. Then they went to San Francisco, and they beat them 19-3. 2 huge games for the Seahawks that put them right back in the mix for the NFC West title. Is, the Cardinals had the inside shot through the first half of the season, but then they started to fall. Injuries finally caught up to them, especially a quarterback. But then week 14, the Seahawks ended up going to Philadelphia, and that was a really good matchup. They ended up beating them by 10 points, and that was still at a point where the Eagles had a shot at the NFC East. They were in playoff contention. They ended up finishing with 10 wins. So it's actually, that both those games too. So I was talking about how the Packers beat the Eagles, and then when the Seahawks beat the Eagles, those games right there are the type of games that took the Eagles out of the playoffs, losing to playoff teams. But back to the Seahawks season in Week 15, they faced back off against the Niners, this time in Seattle, and they swept the season series against the 49ers. They had faced them last year in the NFC Championship game, the Conference Championship. This game that we're talking about last year was Seattle versus San Fran, but this year they swept the Niners during the season, and that went a long way towards knocking the Niners out of the playoffs. And then the next week in Week 16, they went to Arizona, division title on the line, and they won 35-6. Russell Wilson, 339 passing yards in that game. Luke Wilson, 139 receiving yards for the tight end, and Marshawn Lynch had 113 rushing yards. They came up huge. They clinched the division right there. That went a long way towards them also getting that #1 seed. And then in Week 17, they finished off strong, avenging their earlier season loss against the Rams as they hosted the Rams in Seattle. They beat them 20-6 to finish off with a 6-game winning streak, and then with a win against the Carolina Panthers in the divisional round, and that makes it 7 games in a row, as they haven't lost a game since November 16th. And when they faced last week off against the Panthers, they came up big. Marshawn Lynch didn't really have a lot of rushing yards, but they proved that they could win even when beast mode doesn't pick up 100 yards on the ground. We saw what he did, earlier in the year when the first time the Packers saw them. He was able to put up plenty of yards, and we know that it's going to be, a wet game there. There's like a 70% chance of of rain, whatever they call it there, precipitation, whatever. But yes, it's more than likely going to rain. If it gets cold enough, that rain could become snow. Of course, it looks like it's just going to be rain, though. There's also a chance that the New England game is going to have some rain, too, but even more of a chance there in Seattle. As anybody who's familiar with the weather in Seattle, it's a very rainy city. I believe it has the most rainfall of any major city in the United States of America, definitely within the continental United States. So it should be wet, and that means it's going to be tough for these teams to hold on to the ball. So that's going to put definitely an emphasis on defense. And the best defense in the league is the Seattle Seahawks. Let's actually look at the numbers offensively and defensively between these two teams. And when it comes to passing proficiency, the Packers are 8th in the NFL in passing yards per game. And the Seahawks, oh darn, actually ended up just going out of the clicking the wrong button. Alright, the Seahawks are 27th. So the Packers are one of the best passing teams. And the Seahawks, they struggle to pass the ball. But when it comes to defense against the pass, the Packers are 10th. So you have a pretty decent secondary. But the Seattle Seahawks are #1. The Legion of Boom has been playing at a peak performance level. They're back playing just as strong as they were last year when they won it all. And they are the #1 secondary in the NFL. And so that's going to be quite the matchup to watch. Aaron Rodgers up against the Legion of Boom. We saw week 1, he didn't even pass the ball against Richard Sherman. He stayed away from Richard Sherman the whole entire game, and Maxwell ended up making him pay. And he was held to under 200 yards. So you got to give the advantage to Seattle in the passing game, even though they do struggle to put up yards themselves. But they're just so strong defensively that they definitely have the advantage there. And then we look at the rushing yards. In terms of yards on the ground per game, the Packers are 11th in the NFL, and the Seattle Seahawks are #1. as beast mode overtook DeMarco Murray, and the Seahawks overcame the Cowboys in terms of it was a battle all year long between who was number one. Was it going to be DeMarco? Was it going to be beast mode? Would it be the Seahawks? Would it be the Cowboys? And in the end, it ended up being the Seattle Seahawks that were the number one rushing team in the NFL. Although DeMarco Murray did, let's see right here. Oops, sorry about that. A little delay here. This is all improv, people. We do this all right off the cuff. All right, yeah, here we go. So DeMarco Murray did finish with 500 more yards than Marshawn Lynch, but as a team, and especially because of Russell Wilson and the great year he had, we'll actually go over their individual stats in a minute. But Marshawn Lynch, he had 1,306 yards. Murray ended up having 1,845, but I said the Seahawks, though, as a team, were the number one rushing team. When we look at the defense, when it comes to yards allowed on the ground, the Packers were 23rd. So they struggle to stop the run, and they're going to be in big trouble against the number one rushing offense in the NFL. And when it comes to the Seahawks defense, they're third against the run. And actually, for the most part of the season, for like the first half of the season, maybe first 10 games of the season, it was actually the run defense of the Seahawks that was playing better than their passing defense. And that was actually up there. And their passing defense was actually lower, but they came on extremely strong in the second half of the season, especially during that 6-game winning streak. They just shut everybody down. And then the numbers they put up there is what rose them all the way to the top and made them the number one passing defense. But that rushing defense is strong as well. And last year that was somewhat of a weakness, but you could almost make the argument that the Seahawks defense might just be better the way they're playing all around. So again, when it comes to running the ball, you got to give the advantage to Seattle. And we'll look at here, let's see, points scored. And, how many points do these two teams put up per game? Well, the Packers are 6th in the NFL in points scored. The Seahawks are 9th. But actually, it's not quite as close as that because the Packers, they score almost at will. Actually, is that right? What do we got here? No, the Packers are number one. All right, excuse me. I was looking at the wrong stat. The Packers are number one, and the Seahawks are 10th when it comes to points per game. And the Packers put up 30.4 points per game. The Seahawks put up 24.6 points. So it's a difference of almost 6 points. It's 5.8 points more that the Packers score per game than the Seahawks on average. That's almost a touchdown. That's, like 2 field goals or a touchdown and a missed extra point. But if we look at the defense, when it comes to points allowed, the Seahawks are only allowing 15.9 points per game. That's good enough for number one in the NFL. Not only are they the number one team against the pass, the number 3 team against the rush, they're the number 1 team in points allowed. They don't let teams score. They're only letting up 15.9. In the Green Bay Packers, they're not bad. They're 13th, but they're letting up 21.8 points per game. So again, that's a big swing, and that's a difference of actually 5.9. Or it says 6.9. 5. Let's see. No, it's 5.9. So it's actually, the swing is about the same difference on offense as on defense, that the Packers score the same amount more than the Seahawks allow that many less. You see what I'm saying? So they kind of actually match up pretty evenly when you look at that and you see that, all right, well, they score almost a touchdown more, but the Seahawks allow a touchdown less. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. We saw how it worked out back in week 1. It ended up being a 20-point win for the Seattle Seahawks. I don't necessarily think it's going to be that much of a blowout. The second time around, I expect it to be a closer game this time, but I do expect the Seattle Seahawks to win this one for sure. I'm actually going to go ahead and look into some more stats here. Let's go over the numbers for the Packers on the season. We look at Aaron Rodgers. He had 4,381 passing yards. He had 38 touchdowns and just 5 interceptions. So Aaron Rodgers had a phenomenal season. He protects the ball really well, and he can sure air it out. But against this Seattle Seahawks secondary, he's going to have his work cut out for him. And, there's been, of course, the stories about, with his calf, how that's doing, how he got stepped on there in the, regular season, closing things out. And then also he has some issues with that, last week as well. But he didn't stop him from winning that game against Dallas. Didn't stop him from beating Detroit either there in that final week of the season. Of course, it's going to be a different story up in Seattle and with the weather conditions as well. And ELiAS, actually, there's been some issues about him. I think he didn't really practice. He wasn't like full practice. He was like, slight practice. He wasn't a full participant. He was limited. But during the season, ELiAS had a good year. He had over 1,000 yards rushing. He had 1,139 yards rushing. He had 9 touchdowns on the ground. He also ended up with 4 touchdowns receiving and 427 receiving yards. And that was good enough for 4th on the team. He actually had more receiving yards than Corliss, their tight end. But they're all about the pass. And they had 2 receivers that both had over 1,000 yards, and that's Jordy Nelson, who had 1,519 yards, so 1,519 yards for Jordy. He had 13 touchdowns on the season. And Randall Cobb had 126. No, he had 126 something, man. He had 1,287 yards receiving, and he had 12 touchdowns. So they both had over 1,000 yards. They both had double-digit touchdowns. That's pretty impressive. Not too many teams have a receiving core that's that dangerous. And that's not to mention Devontae Adams, the rookie, had 446 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns during the season. He had the big game last week. But with Jordy and Randall Cobb, though, those are 2 deep threats that at any point, if Aaron Rodgers just hits Jordy in stride or hits Randall in stride, they're both very fast receivers, and they're tough to catch once they get going. And at any point, all it takes is a couple of seconds for the Packers to score, because just Aaron Rodgers is one of the best quarterbacks when it comes to the long ball, when it comes to the deep pass, those deep routes, airing it out to his receivers. Aaron Rodgers does it better than anybody else when it comes to that specific point of his game plan and that specific point of attack. The Packers, that's like their strength. That's what they're really excellent at doing, is those long, deep passes, airing it out. He's very, accurate on the long pass, more accurate probably than anybody else in the NFL with those long passes. And that's something that the Seattle Seahawks defense is going to have to neutralize that. They're not going to be able to let up too many deep passes. They're going to have to make sure that they bring the safeties over to, cover the underneath and up top, depending on the, coverage from the corners. So, and that's really where the strength of the Seahawks defense is, with Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor, 2 of the best safeties, if not the 2 best safeties in the entire NFL, along with 2 of the best corners in Richard Sherman and Byron Maxwell, who are very, Richard Sherman, of course, everyone knows he's the best. Byron Maxwell, very underrated, and he might just be almost as good as Sherman. He's right there with him. Like I said, he's very underrated. People don't really necessarily give him his props because he's kind of like the 4th man in the band of the Legion of Boom. But he is just as good as the other guys. If he was on any other team, Byron Maxwell, it would be getting a lot more press. Like if Byron Maxwell was on the Packers, you'd be talking all about Byron Maxwell. If he was on any other team, like I said, it would be all about him. But when you're on a team that's just filled with talent, you can sometimes, a guy like that's going to get overlooked. But he's definitely more than capable, and that's what makes them so strong. Is their defense is extremely deep, and all around their linebacking core and up front as well. And they've also got players, for days. Like the Seahawks, it doesn't even matter. Like their second string guys aren't even really second string because of the way they substitute. They've always got somebody fresh in there, and they've got so much talent on defense. not to mention their offense as well. But actually, let's look at the Packers' defense here for a moment, because we're going over their stats. And when it comes to their leading tackler, the leading tackler for the Packers was the tight end Morgan Burnett. He had 129 tackles on the season, and he had 1.5 sacks. And Clint Dix had 94 tackles. A.J. Hawk had 90 tackles. When it comes to sacks, Clay Matthews had 11 sacks for the Pack. Julius Peppers had 7 sacks. As a team, they had 41 total sacks. And for interceptions, Tramon Williams had 3 interceptions to lead the team in interceptions. He also, Casey Hayward had 3 interceptions as well, so he was tied right there with Tramon Williams. And as a team, they had 18 picks. And with the Packers, like I said, their strength is that long ball. But Eddie Lacy gets overlooked a lot because they don't really have to run the ball that much. They don't necessarily. If you look at the numbers, overall, they ran the ball 435 times, whereas they passed it 536 times. So they passed the ball 100 more times than they ran the ball. But if you actually look at the runs by Lacy, he had 246, and Starks had 85. So it's even less than that. They are very pass heavy. They pass the ball 60-70% of the time, really, in a typical game. So Eddie Lacy gets overlooked, but as he showed against Dallas, he can run for 100 yards. He's more than capable. That's even the thing. He's got fresh legs because they're not just always pounding with them. But it'll be interesting to see, how he holds up, because at least from what I'm seeing, it looks like he might be a little banged up. I don't necessarily think it's going to matter one way or the other, because I'm not really expecting the Packers to have much of a chance in this game, even though it is Green Bay and you can never count out the Packers. I mean, the way they play, even though it's not in Green Bay and they're kind of a different team on the road, they play a lot better at home than they do on the road, but they're still formidable on the road. Part of the reason, though, they do have their struggles on the road is because their defense isn't, their strength, nor is their running game. And those are the two things you need to have to win on the road. You have to have a strong running game. You have to have a strong defense. You have to be able to stop the run. And if you could stop the run and you can run the ball and you can, win the battle of the time of possession, then you can win on the road. Those are things the Packers don't have. But Aaron Rodgers, though, he's so good, and especially, like I said, with that strength of their deep pass, they're a threat to score at any point, where they get a big play that puts them right back in it. So you could be beating the Packers all game long, but a couple plays is all it takes for them to get right back in it and be there in the end. So you never count them out. And their defense, they come up clutch. If you've seen the Packers throughout the season, even in the their one playoff game last week, the defense makes plays when they need to. They might allow a lot of yards. They might allow a decent amount of points, not too much, but when they really need a big play, they seem to find a way to come up with that play. And they've made some big plays throughout the season. Let's look at the Seahawks and their statistics. And when it comes to Russell Wilson, his passing yards on the game, he has 3,475 passing yards on the season, 20 touchdowns, and just 7 interceptions. So not quite as many, touchdown passes as Aaron Rodgers. Of course, he has 100 less passes, but his interception is low, only 7. So he keeps it pretty low, just 2 more. He protects the ball really well, even though in this Madden gameplay that you're watching while I'm talking, for those of you that are still watching and listening, I actually threw a lot of interceptions, but I don't think that's going to really happen, but that's just how it ended up playing out in this Madden game, which I'm a little upset because I like Russell Wilson a lot. I was kind of like, man, I can't believe I'm throwing so many interceptions with him in this gameplay. But if you see, though, the defense and the running game is really what it's all about for Seattle, and that's what it's going to come down to in this game. Although in our gameplay there, you see it's kind of a low-scoring game. That could be what it ends up being. I wouldn't be surprised. but I also think both these teams are more than capable of putting up a lot of points as well. So you could see either or. Like, these teams are definitely capable of playing either way. Like, you could see just a knockdown, drag out, smash mouth, defensive battle, low scoring, like 10-9 or something. 12-8, even though how would you end up with 8? But anyway, you could see something like that. But then again, you could also see something where it's like 30-28 or something, or maybe even more points, because like I said, they both can put up points on the scoreboard. But Russell Wilson, not only did he have, though, that 3,475 yards passing, he also had 849 yards on the ground and 6 rushing touchdowns to go with his 20 passing touchdowns. So those are pretty big numbers for Russell Wilson. He almost had 1,000 yards on the ground, just 151 yards shy. But the leading rusher was beast mode Money Marshawn Lynch. He had 1,306 yards. He also had 13 touchdowns on the ground as well. And beast mode also had 367 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns receiving. And their leading receiver was Doug Baldwin with 825 passing yards, and he also had 3 touchdowns. Curse had 537 receiving yards and a touchdown. Let's say then Luke Wilson, 362 yards and 3 touchdowns. So as you can see, they don't really have big numbers through the air, but Russell Wilson comes up clutch. We saw last week against Carolina, all 3 of his touchdown passes in that game came on 3rd downs. So Russell Wilson is the definition of clutch. He comes up with the big plays when he needs to. He can also extend the play with his feet, as he's one of the best rushing quarterbacks in the NFL, and one of the best at doing it too. I mean, because Russell Wilson, the way he gets a lot of yards, but it's always his last option is to run. He's not thinking run from the jump. It's kind of like he makes his reads, he checks down, and then the last check on the list is, hey, is there a running lane? Run. And so then a lot of quarterbacks don't necessarily have that option because they don't have the speed or the agility. He does. And so boom, he makes his checks, he reads the defense, checks down, no one's open, he's taken off. And then usually that's the thing, if no one's open, that means there is a running lane open, and he's usually good to get a first down. So he actually averages 7.2 yards per run. So that's pretty close. That's almost twice as much as you would expect out of a running back. Even though Marshawn Lynch averages 4.7 yards per game. In Robert Turbin, he has 310 yards on the season. He averages 4.2 yards per carry. And even Christine Michael has 175 yards rushing, but he averages 5.1. And so you got to give a lot of credit to the offensive line of Seattle, one of the best offensive lines in football. Definitely one of the most underrated offensive lines. They definitely don't get enough credit, but that's just because this team is so talented all around. When you have so much talent on the defense, so much talent at the key positions, the big positions like quarterback, running back, and even the receivers are very underrated and very talented as well, as they've got a bunch of guys in the receiving core that can get the job done. They also got a lot of talent at tight end, and then they got such a great offensive line. I mean, the Seahawks all around, there's a reason why they're the number 1 seed, the reason why they're hosting the NFC Conference Championship. Let's look at their defense. Their leading tackler, KJ Wright, 107 tackles. Bobby Wagner, 104 tackles. Earl Thomas, 97 tackles. Cam Chancellor, 78 tackles. Richard Sherman, 4 interceptions to be the leading interceptor on the team. Michael Bennett, 7 sacks, leads the team in sacks. Bruce Irvin, 6.5 sacks as well. Cliff Averill, 5 sacks. Jordan Hill, 5.5 sacks. As a team, they have 37 sacks. They have 13 interceptions. So, I mean, they get after the quarterback. They get after the ball. KJ Wright has forced 3 fumbles. Earl Thomas has also forced 3 fumbles as well. And as a team, they have forced 20 fumbles. So they're getting it in. They also, they're just all around. They get to the ball. They said they early in the season they were playing really good up front with their run defense, but as the season has progressed and they've really gelled and solidified, and they've gotten used to playing as the unit that they are this year, it's a little bit different. A couple players left, they added a couple pieces, but they're really, the core is still there, the main guys are still there. And I mean, there's just so much talent there. I mean, you could just rattle off the names. It just goes on and on all around. I mean, we're saying, but I mean, they said in the secondary, with Richard Sherman and Byron Maxwell and Earl Thomas and Camp Chancellor. Then their linebacking core with KJ Wright and Bobby Wagner and Bruce Irvin up front with Michael Bennett. Also Malcolm Smith in the linebacking core, plus Kevin Williams up front, Tony McDaniel, plus Cliff Averill and Brandon Mebane and O'Brien Schofield and Jordan Hill. It's just so many players on that team. They're so good. Their defense is really it's fun to watch. They're one of the best defenses that's played in a long time, and they're actually the first team since 2005 to win a playoff game after having won the Super Bowl, and they're actually looking to get back to the Super Bowl, and they're looking to try to repeat. Of course, we're not going to get too much into that. We'll talk about that more in after this in the next upon further review, when we go over who won the conference championship games. We're also, make sure to check out our AFC upon further review, and also check out our recaps. But for this game, the way I think it's going to end up going down, I think it will be similar to last time, where it's going to be kind of low scoring to start. I think it'll be pretty close early on. I think the defense is going to make big plays for Seattle. You see beast mode, they're just going to be running the ball. I think, Russell Wilson will come up with clutch plays, some big plays on third down, just as he did last week. Of course, the Packers, they've got a good defense, and they're also opportunistic. I wouldn't be surprised to see some turnovers from both of these teams, as they're so excellent on defense and they're very well evenly matched up. But it's just going to be too much for the Packers. The Seahawks defense is going to be able to come up with some big turnovers, especially in the secondary. One, maybe two interceptions, and that's going to make the difference in this game. And in the second half, beast mode's going to come up with a big run, and that's going to put them ahead. And once they get ahead in the second half, they should be able to close out pretty strong. The Packers will make it interesting. In the end of the game, I expect to see it still be within striking distance, although I wouldn't be surprised if the Seahawks end up winning this one by double digits. But I still think it's going to come down at the end, with Aaron Rodgers still having a chance. But I think in the end, we're going to see some big plays on defense, and probably end up seeing a play from someone you don't necessarily expect, like Byron Maxwell, or maybe somebody else, maybe someone who I haven't even mentioned is going to come up with some big play. Maybe it'll end up being a sack and a fumble, and then they end up getting it like that, or an interception at the end. Somehow they're going to come up with big plays on defense late in the game to stop the Packers from scoring and seal the victory, get it back, and it ends in the victory formation as Russell Wilson will take a knee and the Seahawks are going back to the Super Bowl. That's what I think is going to happen. Let me know what you think is going to happen in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you want more content such as this, subscribe, as we're bringing you recaps and upon further reviews and quick picks for all the games, as we have all season long and through the playoffs, all the way through the Super Bowl. Also, make sure to check out our year-end reviews, as we'll be doing year-end reviews for all the teams for the 2014 NFL season. We're also going to be covering the baseball and basketball and hockey upcoming. The seasons for hockey and basketball are already going on. The playoffs for those aren't too far away. We cover those as well. We'll also be covering some March Madness. That's coming up. That's right around the corner. So keep an eye out for that. And, spring training and opening day aren't far behind. So make sure to keep an eye out for all of that. Plus, we got some other cool stuff in store for 2015. And once again, thank you very much for watching. It is greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day and have a great weekend, and enjoy all the sports.